Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in on behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair. It's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Tanya Hester and Jeanette Ruiz to discuss wallet activism. Use every dollar you spend, earn, and save as a force of change. Published by our friends at Ben Bella Books. Tanya Hester is the author of Wallet Activism and Work Optional, Retire Early the Non-Penny Pinching Way. After spending most of her career as a consultant to Democratic politics and progressive issue campaigns, and before that as a public radio journalist, Tanya retired early at the age of 38. She has also been an outspoken voice in the personal finance media community to consider systemic barriers and opportunity gaps rather than simply pushing people with lots of advantages already to accumulate more wealth. Part of why the New York Times called her the matriarch of the women's fire movement. To moderate tonight's conversation, we are also joined by Jeanette Ruiz, who is a multi-passionate Miami native. In her current role as program director for the Miami Climate Alliance, she works with the community and member organizations towards people-centered solutions for our climate crisis. Formerly the co-host of the podcast Planted in Miami, she and husband Alex Ruiz sought out individuals pushing the city forward through their actions. Passionate about animal welfare and the environment, she has also worked as the developmental director for the #1 vegan food festival in the country, Seed Food and Wine Festival, and co-led the Miami Running Club chapter of No Meat Athlete. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask a question by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. And you can order your copy of Wallet Activism from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. Love Books and Books. Hi, Tanya.
Hi, I'm so excited to be having this conversation with you. I've been really looking forward to it.
So am I. As we were talking just before we started, like my book is all marked up. I was reading this over the holiday season where it's prime shopping season, very appropriate time to be reading it because it made me think about every single purchase that I made, and you saved me money. So let's chat.
Great.
So let's start off with the obvious question. What is wallet activism and what made you become a wallet activist?
Yeah, wallet activism is using your financial power to create change in the world, and it's your financial power in all its forms. One of the things that I talk about in the book that I think folks can probably relate to is a lot of the messaging that you've received about how to operate in the world in an ethical way or a responsible way, or as someone who cares about the climate, is to shop. And to shop differently, maybe buy this instead of buy this. And I really wanted to stress that this is about so much more than shopping. And oftentimes, as you just mentioned, it's about not shopping. And I think that raises the point too, that it's often much cheaper to live this way than it is to do sort of the quote unquote conscious consumerism phrase that a lot of folks will put out there, where they say sort of like, it's better to buy a Tesla, which is really expensive, than it is to buy a Ford, or it's better to buy Patagonia than it is to buy a secondhand jacket. And those are things that I think we can push back against. And so really that pushback is also part of wallet activism, like learning to see through those marketing messages so that you can make choices that align to your values.
So what got you interested in this?
I think like a lot of folks, I felt like I really wanted to know that I wasn't funding bad things with the money I was spending, and that I was hopefully also doing some good, but it felt really unclear what the right things were to do. And I think a lot of that was because it's so obvious sometimes that things are greenwashing, that someone is trying to make a product look much more sustainable or environmentally friendly than it is. Or you could tell that, okay, that maybe this message sounds good, but I know this person's trying to sell me something. How do I kind of figure this out? And I did some research on my own as a consumer and realized I don't actually know what the right thing is. And I worked in social change and public policy for a lot of years and felt like I had a pretty good level of savvy about how things worked, but I still felt lost with some of the decisions. So it was really, to me, trying to find answers, frankly, for myself, but then wanting to share those with others, because I think a lot of people feel hopeless right now. They feel like there's not much that individuals can do. And when we see, okay, well, I as an individual am just one person, and then at the same time, our leaders aren't doing enough, it's really easy to succumb to that climate doom, or that feeling that we're never going to make progress with social issues or equality. And I just don't believe that's true. And I wanted to make sure that people felt hopeful, clear-eyed about the hard realities of things, but also hopeful and empowered to do things that actually make a difference.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I really enjoyed reading this book is that it's definitely a book that you're going to come back to time and time again, because I can see it as you evolve as a person in your situation. Like, there'll be certain circumstances where you can practice wallet activism. And for me, I'll give you a perfect example. Our dryer in our house broke recently, and we had to go out and purchase a new one, right? And I was reading the book at the time, and I'm like trying to do my due diligence of like, is it energy efficient? Like, is it, where was it manufactured? What is the carbon footprint, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality was I had a certain amount of space to put this dryer in, and only one fit the profile. And that was the one that we had to go with. So you talk about perfection in the book and how, you can't be perfect, right? So I wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit, because it does get overwhelming when you do try to be more conscious with your purchases. So right off the bat, like, how do you deal with that, and how do you address it in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we all are surrounded by imperfect choices. They're really, frankly, under capitalism, there are no perfect decisions that we can make. Everything that we're going to do is going to do some harm in some way, whether it's just using some resources that could remain in the ground or go to someone else. I faced something really similar last winter, a little over a year ago. Our furnace died when it was 0 degrees outside. And in a perfect world, we would have loved to have painstakingly researched and tried to find exactly the best furnace. And I really would have loved to go with a heat pump, but it's such an expensive thing, and it was 0 degrees outside and we needed heat. And so we ended up buying like the best furnace we could get quickly. And I really am unhappy about that. But, we're all just doing our best here. And it was one of those things where we said, okay, well, if we know we just bought a new natural gas furnace, we'd really prefer if it could have been electric, that could be powered by wind or solar. But we're going to resolve to use as little heat as possible. So even though it's a fossil fuel appliance, we're going to try not to use it too much. And I think with a dryer, if you have to buy an imperfect dryer, maybe it's resolving then to try to hang laundry up if you can. I know there in Miami, it's humid a lot of the time, so that might be challenging.
Yeah.
But, sort of applying that concept to your own situation and figuring out, okay, are there ways that I can undo some of the impact of this choice? If you have gas-powered car and you don't feel great about that, are there times when you could leave the car home and walk or bike or take public transit or carpool with someone else? There are always ways to scale back the resources that we're burning through.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think another thing that was super helpful while I was going through that whole process was you have a chapter on developing an activist mindset, and you list different values in it, and trying to not be perfect, but trying to just pay attention to like, these are the issues that I want to support, right? So when you're making purchases, like, you keep these in mind so that you're not completely overwhelmed, because you'll have a situation where like you really don't have a choice, but then there are other situations where you do. So can we talk a little bit about that and how you have your value statement? Because I really love that.
Yeah, great. Oh, I'm glad that spoke to you. The analogy that I probably use too much, but I think it just really illustrates this perfectly very quickly, is if you are a vegetarian and someone says, do you want a burger? You don't have to use any willpower. You don't waste any of your limited attention or energy thinking that choice through. You just say, no, I don't eat burgers. So the idea with trying to come up with a financial value statement is trying to figure out what are the things that are most important to you, and what are the values that you hold dear, what are the issues you care most about, because sometimes things will be in conflict. Like, for example, if you are solely focused on the climate and climate change, you're probably going to be focusing on reducing what you buy as much as you can all the time, versus someone who's really focused on reversing the racial wealth gap. they might be focused on spending a fair amount of money at maybe small businesses owned by people of color, women of color, people with disabilities, any sort of marginalized status that you're focused on. And that's going to be a very different set of financial behaviors that go with that. So by doing this exercise and figuring out, okay, here is what I let guide me, here is what I don't spend money on, or a financial choice I don't make, it lifts that burden off you from always having to feel exhausted by the choices, and it helps you automate a lot of that. So I think that that's a really helpful thing. And I know it's early in the book, so it's one of those things where it's easy to skip over it. But if you do that, come back to it, make a point, after you've read the rest, to spend a little time thinking about it, because it's really for your own sort of sanity as you go to the store, so that you don't feel like you have to do a ton of research on every single little thing.
And I think it also helps you realize that you're already doing a lot of that already, right? Because that's when I did the exercise, I realized, you know what, I've already been making these purchases like mindfully, subconsciously, but but I have been like supporting the things that I find important, right? So that's why I think it's definitely important to do this, and to kind of put intention behind what it is that you want to support. And since it is the new year and people are making resolutions, I think that that's a great exercise to do, to just kind of like frame how you'd like to move forward in terms of like which companies you want to support. You also talk about the bad guys, the good guys, and how to tell the difference, right? And I think to me, this was very enlightening, because you mentioned greenwashing before, and how these companies really try to we saw it in 2020 with the racial injustices and the protests, and how a lot of these companies, they came out in solidarity, and you're like, is this something that's authentic, or is this something that you're just trying to sell us more stuff, right? So can we talk a little bit about that, and how you can navigate those waters?
Yeah, I think it's becoming trickier, because every brand would have you believe that they are perfect on every issue all the time. And with Black Lives Matter, when George Floyd protests were happening, especially, so many brands came out and put the black square up on their social, or put all these messages out saying, we stand with, Black Lives Matter, which that's fine. That's a good first step. It's good to normalize having that conversation, especially with groups that have been talked about as fringe before. But it's very easy to look on a company's website and look at who are their leaders, who is on their board of directors, and to see, does this match? They claim to be committed to racial equity, but that's a lot of white men on their board. Or, with a lot of environmental organizations, it's often a lot of white folks employed. And you can take a look at that and see if what they're promising to you as a customer or potential customer matches what they're actually doing. And it's not to say you can't ever shop with a company like that or do business with them in some way, but you might use that as a moment to let them know that your future business is contingent on them actually backing up their words with action. Because that's how things change, is when businesses hear from customers. One of the things that I think is important to talk about is that sometimes the best way to create change is actually to shop, or actually to give business to companies, which I know runs counter to what a lot of folks who are in the environmental movement will say. But if you boycott something, but you never shopped with them to begin with, they're unlikely to listen to you. And the carrot of future business, or being able to get sort of a veneer of good corporate social responsibility, can often be a big motivator for companies. So that's not to excuse a lot of bad behavior, or say we should all be consumers 24/7. We have to consume less. That's really essential to address climate change. But there are ways that you can do it that are really intentional, and that can actually over time lead to good progress.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And, along those lines too, you talk about the true cost of purchases and the externalities. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. You give this, okay, good. You give the example of a spiral notebook, and I have to tell you, it sent me into a tizzy, because I was like, oh my gosh, just tracking this one spiral notebook and what it has to go through to get to us. And then once we possess it, that was another thing that was enlightening for me too, is like, once you possess something, whether it's a pen or a book, and it's like how it got to you, the process, and then what you plan to do with it, right? How you even plan to dispose it. So can you talk about just like the true cost of a purchase and what that means?
Yeah, I mean, whether we're talking about the food that we eat, the things that we buy, where we live, the work we do, so much of our experience and what we see is really divorced from the full reality of it. And I wanted to use something really similar, or really simple rather, like a spiral notebook, to say, okay, this is made out of two things. It's paper and it's a metal spiral. But even for something so simple, it still involves mining in the global south. It involves trees coming down. It involves pollution. Water is the most, paper is the most water intensive industry in the world. So producing that paper means cranking through a lot of water, putting a lot of pollution out. And then it goes through a lot of human hands as well to get to you. And all of that stuff matters and adds up, but almost none of that is actually priced into the dollar you might pay for a cheap notebook, or the $20 you might pay for an expensive notebook. Most of that price is going to the company who made it and paying their profits. It's not going to the people who manufactured it. It's not going to the communities impacted by the mining or the factory pollution or any other number of, the externalities. Externalities are just things that are required to make something, but are not actually priced in. So you think about with cigarettes, that's an easy way to think about externalities. When you buy that pack, my understanding is they're quite expensive everywhere now, but even still, that's not covering healthcare costs of you as a smoker. It's also not covering any of the healthcare costs of all the people who will be impacted by the secondhand smoke, or the farm workers who pick the tobacco and are thus exposed to herbicides and pesticides and all those harmful chemicals. So thinking about that and thinking about what is the true cost of something, is this something that's really inherently polluting? Is this something that's made of fossil fuels, which means that carbon is coming out of the ground and going into the atmosphere? Is it something that's never going to biodegrade and is going to be entombed for all time in a landfill? All of that stuff, when you just sort of have an understanding of it, I think it becomes easier. It might feel overwhelming at first, but the goal is to internalize that stuff so that the next time you buy something, you recognize that, okay, it's not just a pen. This is a fairly complex mechanism. It's got metal in it. It has plastic in it. It has ink. What's that ink made of? Where it just sort of helps you, I think, say, let's hit the pause button before I buy something without thinking about it. And when you combine that with your value statement, then it becomes easy to say, okay, these are things I'm just not going to buy anymore, or I'm not going to engage with in a financial way anymore. And these are things where I will still buy them, but I want to be more intentional about it. That's really the goal. But just kind of understanding broadly that anything we buy, the cost you pay is not really reflective of its true impact on other people and the environment, I think is really good for kind of changing your view of just casually buying stuff.
Yeah, you're frozen on my end. I'm not sure if other people are seeing that. I mean, I can hear you, so I'm hoping other people can hear you.
I just took my video off to see if I could turn it back on and that would help.
Okay, let's see.
But I'm not sure now how to bring it back. Saviana, if you're there, do you know how to bring my camera back? Thank you.
Okay, you're back. Okay,
am I unfrozen now?
Yeah, you're frozen.
Okay, good.
Okay, good. So that brings me to your guiding questions, which are also helpful, because I keep asking myself that question over and over again. Is it too cheap? At the Miami Climate Alliance, one of our members is We Count, and they advocate for farm workers down in Homestead. And they're always front of mind for me when I go shopping for food, because they talk about just the horrible conditions that they have to work in, not only out there in the heat, but like you said, being exposed to pesticides and just the living conditions and it's just deplorable conditions. So, there is a cost that's not included with your avocado, right? When you go in there. So when you see when you see something that is so cheap, like that's one of your questions, is it too cheap, right? So you have 4 here. For whom can everyone do this? Is it too cheap? And what am I funding? So can you quickly go through those?
Yeah, the idea of the guiding questions is to take a lot of this. I'm sure if you haven't started reading the book, you have a sense that some of this stuff can feel sort of big and overwhelming. And I really wanted to make sure that readers felt trusted. I wanted to trust readers and say, there's some bad news out there, but I believe you can handle it and we're going to find a way through. So the guiding questions are there to help you find a way through some of that complication and to say, okay, I'm getting this marketing message, I'm getting this marketing message, I'm hearing this from environmentalists on Instagram, I'm hearing this from folks in my community, how do I make sense of it all? So that's really the idea of the 4 questions. So the first one, as you said, for whom, is really meant to help you evaluate, if someone is proposing a particular solution, for you to be able to say, okay, does that actually serve justice? By which I mean, giving more power and more financial resources to those who've historically been marginalized or kept out of that power or those resources. Because oftentimes you'll see people who mean very well, but just haven't really thought about this from a justice frame, say, okay, hey, we're gonna, do a whole bunch of like permaculture farming. And you think, okay, that's great. That sounds really good. Permaculture is about regenerating the land. But then you dig a little deeper and you realize, like, this doesn't include farm workers. This doesn't include Indigenous people who need food justice or food sovereignty. It doesn't include a lot of folks. It's really just for sort of like well-to-do hobby gardeners. And that's not true of all permaculture, but some projects I've seen just as an example. And so that might be something where you say, okay, I've heard this compelling thing, but thinking about who it's actually benefiting, it's not benefiting those with the least power. So how can I think about a different solution or dedicate my time or money to something else that will actually help? Can everyone do this is sort of a similar idea, but like what would happen if everyone tried to do this? Like if everyone was a freegan and tried to eat all their food out of the dumpster, then we wouldn't have any food because we need to pay for food to pay the farm workers and pay everyone, which is not to say that some folks can't do that if they're really gung-ho, but it's not a great solution on a broader level, similarly to telling everyone to buy a Tesla or shop at Patagonia. Is it too cheap? I think is really a big one. And I come out of the personal finance space where everyone's looking for a deal all the time. They're trying to save as much money as possible. And it often leads to people prioritizing price above anything else. And that often is a really quick way to shop unethically, to shop in a way that harms other people and the planet much more than it should. And so if you see an avocado for 30 cents that you didn't pick off a tree yourself, okay, that probably was picked by someone who was getting paid literal pennies, anything. And especially if it came from another country and is very cheap, okay, well, it was probably flown in, and does that cover that? And some unscrupulous practices went into that. And finally, what am I funding? I use the Chick-fil-A example a lot. Chick-fil-A is well known for supporting anti-LGBTQ plus legislation and being just sort of generally anti gay, bi, queer, transgender rights. And so understandably, a lot of folks might say, well, I don't want to give Chick-fil-A any business. And that is a totally valid thing to say based on that. Or you might apply that to Amazon, Walmart, whatever company you disagree with their practices on. You can also think about scaling it. So I like to think about it in terms of political contribution. If you pick a politician you really, really don't like, and you think, okay, the amount I'm going to spend with this business, if I was going to give that amount of money to this politician, how would I feel about that? And that can be just a really good guiding way to figure out, okay, am I okay doing this? Because, it's very different to spend $5 or $10 at a restaurant once or twice a year than it is to spend thousands of dollars at a big retailer. So I really encourage folks to think about the biggest things you do first. And we've talked a lot tonight about shopping, but that's, again, also how you earn money. If you're able to invest, where you invest it, where you save it, how you give money, it's all of those different things in there. But thinking about the biggest decisions first will both avoid driving yourself crazy and it will make the biggest impact.
Yeah, I think you're frozen again.
Oh no.
But I could hear you fine.
She's not frozen on my end.
Okay.
She was good?
Yeah, she
Okay,
hasn't
good.
been freezing,
Okay.
So I'm not sure what's going on.
Okay, great. Okay.
We will press ahead and just hope for the best.
So Tanya, I couldn't help but just think about, in Miami, we are experiencing an affordable housing crisis on top of a lot of other crises, right? Just today, one of our organizations, Miami Workers Center, they are at an apartment complex because the residents received eviction notices over the holiday break, and they refused to leave. So they just raised their rate. Raised their rent from $1,000 to $1,650. So here, the average person spends over 50% of their income on rent, right? So when I was reading this book, I have all the communities that we advocate in mind, mine included, who are low and middle income and who really don't have a choice when they go to the store on what to buy. Like you have to, you want to get some affordable food, you go to Walmart, right? Or you go to other established Sedanos or other places around here where you can get cheaper food. You want to get clothes, you have to just go where you can afford, right? And that kind of was just like running in the back of my mind the entire time, because I feel like there are people who are in a situation that are privileged enough to read this book, make some of these choices, and then there's others who are just like, I'm just trying to survive, What I thought was also interesting in the book was how you broke it down to like what you buy and the food. And I almost feel like there should be like little cards that come here that you could tear out, that just you could take with you to the store, because there are little things that you can do even if you're on a really tight budget. So what would you say to someone who would say that to you? Like, I can't do this. Like, I have to just get what I can.
Yeah, I would say that's completely valid. We live in a deeply unjust society, economically speaking, but on a lot of levels as well. And so absolutely. I mean, I think that the thing I really wanted to do with the book was to make the action steps as actionable as possible. And I think that for many of us, we can consume less. We can shift some of our maybe food we buy from one thing to another thing instead. But for folks who can't, the reality is those folks also aren't the problem. People who can't afford to make a lot of different choices also aren't the ones driving climate change. They're not the ones running companies that are exploiting workers and contributing to massive inequality. And so I think for folks who feel that they look at this and say, okay, I love these principles, but there's not much I can do here. I mean, I'm sorry. And I think we should all fight for better economic justice, but that's not the reality for as many folks. But for anyone who feels that way reading it, I think the good news is that you're not the problem, if that makes sense. It's really the wealthier folks who are over consuming, who are exploiting others or benefiting from the exploitation of others, even if, you don't feel like you're doing it directly. We're all in some way benefiting from the exploitation of others, including folks who can't afford to have a lot of choices and are buying the cheapest food. That's made possible by other people with limited options who have to do some of that really underpaid work. So yeah, I wish that I could have written this book from within a just society in which everyone had choices. But if we lived in that world, we also wouldn't need book. So I know people in virtually all cities are facing that problem of having to spend an extremely high percent of income on housing. People who earn the median wage can't afford a 2-bedroom apartment in a single American city. And I know that in Miami, you're also dealing with a ton of kind of the front wave of climate change that other places aren't dealing with, and that impacts the available housing. We all certainly saw the horrific collapse of the condo building. Was that just last year? My goodness, what is time?
I know.
But all of these issues are interconnected. And so really what I would say is, just for those who do feel you have choices, I think listening to this and seeing that lots of folks don't, I think if you're able to make choices, it sort of says that those who can make those choices have a responsibility to do so, because so many others are simply unable to.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that. And I was also thinking about, when I was reading this, just the impact of COVID and how we're now seeing kind of like the ripple effect with our supply chains and people getting sick and just disrupting. Like, my niece goes to school in DC. She goes to college in DC, and she sent us pictures. She went grocery shopping, and there was nothing on the shelves. And I was so worried for her, because I'm like, I just couldn't believe it. I mean, I've been experiencing, but it's been kind of like a slow trickle thing. And when you go to the grocery store, like one thing's out of stock and this is out of stock. So it's going to become harder and harder to support those brands that you do want to support with all that's going on. So have you thought about that as well?
For sure, in a lot of different ways, and one of the things that I think is really important to talk about is when we say supply chain and supply chain shortages, what we really mean is people. We don't have less fossil fuel in the ground, or not meaningfully so, that we can pump out and use to make plastic. We don't have, it's not like all the machines around the world that make things and transport things are broken down. It's that people are sick all over, or millions of people have died of COVID. And that, though a lot of those folks were old enough to be out of the workforce, a lot of others weren't. They were still working and performing really essential functions. So supply chain shortages really means we've been deeply, deeply mistreating our fellow humans, and that's affecting us. Here, when I live in Lake Tahoe, California, which is in the mountains, we've had shortages compounded by heavy snow. And so we had empty shelves also, because just trucks couldn't get through to restock the stores. And so I think a lot of people are feeling that stuff compounded and feeling like you just have to do your best. In the early days of the pandemic, I'm pretty significantly immunocompromised from birth, and we didn't feel it was safe to go to the store before we were vaccinated. And so we were having to shop with people who I don't normally shop with, or companies that I don't feel great about, just because we couldn't get groceries otherwise. And that's with me having a decent number of choices. But so I think that it really just underscores, I think, what maybe the first point you raised tonight about not aiming for perfection, doing the best you can with the choices you have in that moment. And during COVID, we have even more imperfect choices than usual. I think where you can consider, could I live without this thing? Do I need to buy it? Sometimes the answer might be yes, but other times it might be no. And in that case, do your best. And then I don't want to make everyone feel super stressed out about it. It's like, do your best and then don't lose any more sleep about it. And then just over time, trying to continually improve. That's really the goal. It's not to say, okay, I'm morally pure because I never shop at store X or anything like that.
Yeah. Do your best and don't lose sleep about it. That's a tattoo. That's good. So I'm going to invite the viewers. If you guys have any questions, just drop them in the question box, and we will answer them for you. But until then, I wanted to also, I like how the book is broken down into two parts. So one is becoming a wallet activist, and then part two is practicing wallet activism in every aspect of your life. And one that really stood out to me was where your money lives. So you talk about banks, right? And you talk about investments. And I want to focus on banks because it's something that we've encountered with JP Morgan Chase, right? And other banks that invest in fossil fuels. And they're also very much so in environmental conferences and, just trying to be that good guy, right? So I learned a lot in terms of where else you can place your money. And you've given me a lot of food for thought with that. And I think that's something that most of us could probably do, is change our bank to make a difference. So can you elaborate on that, Lo?
Yeah, I'm so glad that jumped out at you, because honestly, if that's the one outcome of this book, is that more people change where they bank, I will consider that a complete success. If you look in personal finance conversations, there is so much conversation around responsible investing, which, first of all, most people can't afford to invest anything. So that's not a very inclusive action. But second of all, you can't actually draw a straight line between, if you buy a share of ExxonMobil, one of the biggest oil companies in the world and a, huge polluter in climate terms, and an exploiter of humans around the world, that dollar that you've invested in them doesn't go to someone at Exxon. It doesn't, affect their profits. It does help hold the share price up, but it's a much murkier line. And if you get rid of a share of ExxonMobil, a lot of those shares of fossil fuel companies are just being snapped up by private equity investors who are saying, hey, all the people who care about the climate are dumping this stuff. We're going to get a bargain, but they're still holding on to that stock. So it's not necessarily pushing the companies to do things any differently, which is really the goal of divesting. With banking, however, people don't realize that, we think the money that's going into our savings account or even checking account in some cases is funding small business loans in your community or mortgages for first-time home buyers in your community. And it's true that maybe some of that is happening, but a lot of the money, if you're banking with a big bank, we're talking about JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citi, that sort of level of big bank. Those are the largest funders in the world of fossil fuel projects. And so the money sitting in your savings account is being lent out to fund things like the Dakota Access Pipeline or offshore drilling or tar sands drilling or fracking or any of the practices that we know are really destructive and, just a disaster from a climate perspective. And so if you switch instead to a credit union or a community bank or Black-owned bank, or, there are so many different kinds of options all over the country. It really depends very much where you live. Then you ensure that your money is not funding those projects. And moreover, if others join you and also leave that bank and tell the bank why you're leaving because you don't want to fund fossil fuel projects, that could actually completely cut off the funding for the fossil fuel industry. And at a time when our leaders aren't doing enough to address climate change or to curtail the actions of the fossil fuel industry, that's an incredibly powerful thing. And so, yes, if people will just switch away from the big banks and tell them why you're leaving, that's one of the most powerful things you can do. And I know it's kind of a pain. You have to switch your deposits and everything, but it's like one time. You do that one time and you switch to something better, and then you don't have to think about it anymore. And you know that you're doing good every day. Honestly, that should be the big sticker on the front of the book, is change where you bank, because I hope everyone sees that as a big takeaway.
Yeah, there was a lot of examples. You talked about Wells Fargo and JP Morgan Chase, and I was just like, oh, I've been with them for many, many years, and you gave me great reason to stop. I'm finally going to do it. Like you said, it's a little bit of pain, but it's okay. So we have some questions. First question, what advice would you give someone in their early 20s on world activism?
Yeah, I think honestly, the more that you can get into some of the habits, the better. So, sort of just the American way, the capitalist way is very much to, as you grow in your career and you earn more, you're supposed to spend more. You're supposed to buy nicer things. You're supposed to, people call smaller homes starter homes, with the implication that you're always supposed to move up into a bigger home. And if you can just sort of set your expectations at looking for what is, and this is a concept that I don't talk about in this book, but I do talk about in my first book, Work Optional, of finding your comfortable spending level. Once you get to a point where you say, okay, I can pay all my bills, I can do not everything in the world that I want to do, but I can do enough things that I feel good about, that the work I'm doing is worth it to me, whether that's going to restaurants or going on vacation or being able to do certain hobbies. Really, it's up to you to shape what that looks like. But once you hit that point, then any new money you earn on top of that, one, you can save it so that you can give yourself maybe an earlier retirement or a secure retirement at least, which is becoming increasingly more difficult to achieve. But you can also then keep yourself from getting into a habit of overconsumption, because I think it's much harder to find yourself in your mid-30s, 40s, 50s, and to say, okay, I need to cut my consumption back by half or more, than it is to have never gotten onto that treadmill in the first place of overconsumption. So I think starting out skeptically is good. I think so much of it is just really focusing on your own values also. We started out kind of talking about that, of thinking about what are the issues you care most about, what are the things that just make you angriest that you want to address, because especially younger folks tend to have fewer financial resources, fewer choices. So it's good to be able to prioritize. And if you say, okay, climate is the most important thing to me, that you make your choices in line with that versus, again, the example from earlier, the racial wealth gap, you might make different choices in line with that. But so just give yourself permission not to do everything. You don't have to address every issue with every choice you make. Really focus your efforts on the things that are most important.
Awesome. We have another question. What was the writing process like for this book?
This was a tough one. For folks who have seen the book, the last, let's see, it's a good chunk of the book. It's footnotes, because I really wanted this to be extremely intensively researched. So there are about 500 different citations. So it was really, really research heavy because I didn't want it to be my opinion or the opinion of others out there. I really wanted to say, okay, what are sort of the standard lines of reasoning that are out there, and is that sound? Can we back that up and say, okay, if everybody did X, it truly would be better? Or is the way that people are talking about things really the right way, and how can we think about that? And so it was very much sort of putting some things together that I thought were right, doing the research, discovering that in plenty of cases I was wrong and we needed to do something else. Like, one of the big surprises was I did not expect to find, but buying only organic food, for example, is not the best choice for your wallet. It's not the best choice for the planet, and it's not the best choice for our fellow humans. Organic is better some of the time, but not all the time. And that was pretty surprising to me. I assumed that my advice was going to be buy as much organic as you can possibly afford to buy, but not the case. So I think any big book project tends to be really consuming. It took me about a year total to write it. And it was in my brain kicking around for at least another year and a half before that. And then we spent about 6 months in rounds of editing and then final little things. A book like this that has so much current information, you're afraid before it comes out that something will become outdated before it's even released. Like, I was thinking, like, what happens if 2 weeks before the book comes out, JP Morgan Chase announces that they're divesting from fossil fuels? I knew that wasn't going to happen because they are really committed to making money off of oil and gas and coal. But you sort of think about that stuff. So fortunately, none of that happened. Although maybe unfortunately, I would have loved to have been wrong about some of that stuff and to see more progress. But still hopeful.
It was very timely, especially with the COVID stuff. Okay, last question. There are some local businesses that make delicious hummus and bean salads, and I want to be able to support them as much as I can. However, their products come packaged in number 5 plastic tubs, and I am aware of how much plastic we are adding to our recycling bin. Do you have any ideas how to get my head around this? Or do we resign ourselves to only eating food that we make ourselves at home, which is perfectly fine, but nowhere near as tasty? I feel you, Chris.
Yeah, I think we all feel that. And unfortunately, in a lot of places, number 5 plastic isn't even recycled at all. A lot of towns and cities and recycling systems only recycle number 1 and 2 plastics. And even then, there's no guarantee that it's actually going to make it into a final product. It might go through sorting and then end up in the landfill anyway, which is a huge bummer. I think there are a couple of different things that you can do. So first is, if there's a business that you really love and you love their product, talk to them and ask them, what are some other options here? Could I bring in my own container and have you put the food in it? In some places, in some cities, they're actually working on pilot programs to make that happen so that we can reduce waste. In some places, like where I live, they've actually started where you can buy this reusable takeout container for $5. And then when you go in, you bring your dirty one, and then they give you your food in a clean one. And so it's sort of like a package exchange process. And so that's happening in more places. You can also engage your local government. A lot of cities and towns are looking at alternative packaging to try to reduce single-use plastics. I talk in the book about the nuance that's really necessary in that, and how, for example, the push for plastic straw bans have been really harmful to disabled communities, and also to a lot of lower income folks who can't afford to have a stainless steel straw that they carry around all the time. And so it's really important to think about those changes in ways that are just and inclusive. But it might be something where often when cities and towns or states enact measures to try to reduce the waste that's used, they also provide grants so that the stores can upgrade to different packaging or can install a dishwasher so that they can use regular dishes instead of plastic, that kind of stuff. So you've got a lot of different options, but definitely start with the business itself and tell them how much you love them and that the number 5 plastic tubs are really a problem for you. And you never know what's possible.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that as I said earlier, like this book is definitely one that you will come back to time and time again, and it gives you so many great tips. I mean, you talk about just in the food chapter about garlic and how 90% of it is grown in China, which I did not know, because why would I think about garlic? But it's something so simple that we can grow ourselves. And my husband was right away, okay, we have to grow our own garlic. So we're going to try to grow our own garlic because we use a lot of it. But it's like little nuggets like that you drop in the book, that make it approachable. Like even if like the big things you can't necessarily make the decision to practice wildlife activism on the small scale, you could definitely do something. So I really appreciate that. And if we don't have any more questions, or if there's anything that I left out that you would like to mention, Tanya.
I mean, as you can tell, I can talk at length about any of this stuff because I just care a lot about it, as I'm sure everyone watching does as well. I think a lot of us are really concerned about the climate and where it's headed, and the lack of action on a policy level, both in the US and globally. So I want to assure everybody there is actually a lot that we can do. And as consumers, sure, your individual actions all by themselves don't necessarily fix all our problems. And the goal isn't to lie to you and tell you that they do. We've been doing all these things thinking they would help. Like, we've been recycling for decades and we haven't saved the earth yet. Some of the stuff that we do is good, but not necessarily the impact that we need. But with capitalism and with corporate profit structures, if you think about how you change a law or how you change policy in a way that is for the better, you have to win an election, which means getting at least 50% of the vote. Then there has to be public support through polling of at least 50%. And even then, it doesn't often do it. Right now we've got more than 70% of voters are really concerned about climate change, and yet we don't see meaningful legislation going through. But when you're talking about corporate profits, like we've talked about the banking example tonight, if JP Morgan Chase's quarterly profits go down by 3, 4, 5%, the shareholders are going to notice. The board of directors is going to notice, and they're going to want to know why and what they can do to reverse that. And so if we talk about this in a capitalist frame, we actually, in a way, have more power than we do as voters, because the threshold with voting is so much higher. It's at least 50%, where with capitalism, it could be 3%. And so that's what I would really encourage folks to focus on, is to the extent that you can tell other people around you about some of this stuff and get your friends and family to switch banks also, and really speak up in a way that folks notice, there is really tremendous capacity for change that we can drive as consumers. So I think that's what I'd love to leave folks with. There's really so much power that you have, and I want you to feel that, even if you don't feel like you have a ton of choices, you have much more power than you think.
I love that. We don't have a question, it's just a statement, and I think it's a perfect way for us to end it. It says, no question, but Tanya's awesome. Thanks for writing the book. And I want to second that. Thank you so much for writing this book. If you haven't picked it up yet, please do. And thanks so much for talking to me, Tanya.
Jeanette, you're amazing. Thank you so much for your great questions, and seeing all those flags in your book just totally made my night.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you both for this wonderful conversation, and thanks everyone again for joining us tonight. Don't forget that you can buy your copy of the book from Books and Books' website or in store, and don't forget to shop indie during these times. And thank you both again. Thank you, everyone. Hope everyone has a great night.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, folks.
Bye.